Hi, everybody. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you very much indeed for having us. I'm just going to quickly share my screen because we've got a few slides just to sort of guide our conversation. Bear with me one second. Sorry, so we should be with you any moment. Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to talk to you about Lost Origin. So my name's John Cassy. I run a company called Factory42. We're an immersive content studio, and we were the lead partner on this project. Dani, do you just want to introduce yourself, and then I'll talk about the partners and then hand back to you?
Sure, thanks. Hello, so my name's Dani Parr. I work for the Almeida Theatre. I run all the participation work here. I was the creative director on Lost Origin, so obviously worked very closely with John.
Great. So this was a big consortium project. It was part of the Audiences of the Future Challenge. It was one of the big demonstrator projects that was designed for visitor experiences. And we actually at the start had 8 partners. There's only 6 here, and you might go, what happened to the other 2? Well, basically COVID happened. And basically we began the project as it was going to be looking at how you could bring new audiences to museums. So we worked with the wonderful Natural History Museum and Science Museum, and we're on track to deliver 2 family-based, one dinosaur experience and one robots experience, and there's no prizes for guessing which building was hosting which. We were on track, but then COVID hit. The museums shut down for the first time since the Second World War, and visitor experiences became illegal because everybody had to be at home. So we went through the most extraordinary pivot. The museums had to focus on basically saving their buildings and saving what they do. So they dropped out. And the rest of us ploughed on. So it was Factory42, the Almeida, so that's Dani and my organisations. UKRI are the parent company of Innovate UK, who funded the Audiences of the Future Challenge and have been the most extraordinary supporters through this crazy process. University of Exeter did great work around creative industries. Sky were an investment partner because they're interested in future forms of storytelling, and the Magic Leap are mixed reality sort of headset makers who do some really interesting work in this growing space. So this was our partnership, but it became something very different from dinosaurs and robots. So we've got a clip now. Dani, do you want to introduce the clip and then talk about the creative side of things?
Yeah, sure. So, so as John says,
oh, sorry, I'm trying to.
No, it's all right.
You introduce it, and then I'll do the clip.
I was definitely yes, taken over then. So Lost Origin ended up being a location-based experience. It was an immersive theatrical experience that took place in a warehouse in Hoxton, which, as John says, is a long way from the museums, or in terms of its kind of feel and location. We tried to take all of the elements that we'd created digitally and in some ways kind of set design and story and tried to merge elements of the dinosaur experience and the robot experience into one thing, which was a massive challenge. We ended up with an hour-long experience with audiences of 6 at a time, journeying through a series of about 8 spaces to experience a story, essentially, which had live elements and digital elements. So what you're about to see is a trailer for that experience, and then after you've watched that, we will talk a little bit more about the creative challenges of putting it together.
You are now part of a Wing 7 undercover task force. Our mission is to investigate dark web marketplace, Emporium. We'll sneak into this warehouse owned by deliveries company Origin, a suspected front for Emporium's illegal activities. Meet me here at the Wing 7 field base, and we'll venture inside Origin. Are you ready to go in?
Brilliant. Obviously, tickets not on sale now, but that gave you an idea of the of kind of what we wanted people to experience before they came, and kind of the tone of it, which is quite different from a family dinosaur experience at the Natural History Museum, as you can probably tell. So what we felt was that to expect people to journey out to a warehouse in Hoxton, we were going to have to make something a bit more grown up, and that we were going to probably be catering more to the kind of immersive audience and people who really like coming to slightly sort of unconventional theatrical experiences in the middle of nowhere. So and also Magically had, during the process of us working on the project, had set an age guidance of 14 plus, which wasn't in place at the beginning of the project, so that had also changed some of the nature of the collaboration. So shall I talk a little bit now, John, about kind of the creative challenges? So we've got some bullet points. I'll whiz through them. I'm not going to talk for too long, and because obviously you can ask me questions at the end. So firstly, I thought we'd just talk about kind of how the challenges right from the beginning of the project, rather than just Lost Origin, because obviously this was a very long project with so many different partners. So in terms of kind of beginning, how do you begin a project like this, which is about innovation? We talked a lot, so many times during the project, we would say, oh, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? Oh, it's a bit chicken and egg. So I thought I'd start with that, because at the beginning, obviously, when you're creating a piece of theatre normally, like at the Almeida, the thing we start with normally is the script. So we commission a writer, we create a script, and then everything comes from that. However, when you're creating immersive theatre or site-specific theatre, it's generally a good idea to work alongside a set designer very, very closely. So when I'm doing directing immersive theatre, I like to work hand in hand with responding to the space, being able to see what that can offer in terms of story, whether there are visual ideas that might influence the direction the story goes in. So I'm used to working like that with set designers, but obviously the element that I wasn't used to was then bringing Magic Leap into that and bringing digital teams in. So, but I was keen to use that model and see how the digital side of things could influence the direction that the story went in. So ideas that might be coming from the digital team could influence what story we told, essentially, rather than me and the writer going off into a room on our own and going, this is what we want to make, and then handing it over to the animation team. We wanted it to feel like it was much more collaborative. So, but the challenges about that obviously are, you have to sort of edge forward bit by bit. And although people liked working collaboratively, there were also some frustrations from some of the team, because obviously they wanted script locked, which I'll come back to. Navigating different languages of the team could be a real challenge, because we all came from different disciplines. So some from theatre, from TV, from film, from the kind of XR sort of world. Everyone used slightly different languages. The idea of who leads artistically, visually, aesthetically, whether that's a set designer or whether that's an art director, and how those two people and those two teams work together. Even like tiny things like using the word development in theatre, that means fundraising. Obviously in the visual sector, in the XR sector, that means something completely different. So so kind of we'd have to check ourselves constantly and go, oh, what I mean by that is, or go back and clarify things. And our job titles didn't really mean anything in this project. Nobody really knew what anybody did, so we had to really kind of unpick that. The script locked, like I was talking about, I think is a really, I kind of in the end became really pedantic, and some of the members of Factory42 suffered from me correcting minutes and stuff, because I would kind of say, let's move away from this idea of talking about a script being locked, because in a kind of iterative process, the script is never locked. When you get through audience testing and you are trying stuff out, you're changing stuff all the time. We had 10 live actors involved in this and they were responding and improvising, so script can never be locked. But what we did need to kind of compromise on is elements might need to be locked. So we might need to talk about whether there are bits that will impact the animation of the dinosaur section, which we'd have to agree that the timing would stay completely the same, and certain lines would stay the same if they were embedded into the animation, but stuff that the live actor said could change. So I had to be really clear about what was changing and what wasn't going to change. Obviously challenges working on site. We were in a cold warehouse for months, having to work on site with set being built around us, and then having to kind of rehearse on site, but also test Magic Leap and digital work on site while we were going, and that being a real challenge, and teams not used to working on site, having to work on site so that we could kind of test stuff, because putting the animation in the space really changed the way the animation felt. So I think that was a challenge for lots of people. And audience testing, obviously on a project like this, so much was about how audience interact with the experience. There were elements of it that were game, there were elements of it that were solving. We didn't know in any way until we got audiences in whether they were going to find it too easy, too hard. We didn't know how they were going to respond to getting into Magic Leap, and whether that was going to break the story, because what we did was put them into Magic Leap just for the penultimate room, which was a kind of a 10-minute experience. So it meant up until then they hadn't been in it, and we didn't want to break story world, so we needed to test that. But I put that bit about holding your nerve because I think there is something quite interesting there about, we would get this barrage of audience feedback, often a lot of it contradictory. There were some things that came through really clearly that were incredibly helpful. There were other things where like maybe the first 3 days I remember getting a load of feedback about one of the rooms, Emporium, not working as clear. People saying they wanted much more guidance, they wanted it to be a bit more escape roomy, and I there were a couple of things that I really thought about changing. I didn't. I held my nerve, and then once we put it out to a paying audience and all the paying audiences came in, we started to get feedback that some of those sections were their favourite bits. And so there was a really interesting thing I think that I learned about paying audiences often having quite a different experience than audience testers, and that being quite an interesting challenge as a creative director to know what to change, what to respond to, and what to kind of go, I just know that this is essential to the way I want to tell the story, and I'm going to hold my nerve, and that being a challenge. And then finally I've just put this bit about kind of remembering to enjoy it, because I think any audience experience, a bit like making theatre really, but when you're on site and all you're seeing are the technical problems, you have to take a step back sometimes and just go in with an audience and try and see it through their eyes, that they've never seen this before. They don't know, as you can see from the trailer, they don't know that they're even going to see dinosaurs. So they get to see these kind of ghost dinosaurs later on, which completely blow their minds. Everything is a surprise that they're going through, and trying to kind of remember that and enjoy it with them, so that you can then respond to it and know what needs to be changed and what doesn't need to be changed. But that's a whistle-stop tour that I could talk for about 3 hours about this. So I'll hand over to John, and then obviously I can take questions.
Thanks, Dani. That was really, really, really great. Just going to quickly, hopefully, click you on to the next. Yeah, so I'm going to talk briefly about, like, I guess, taking a step back when you've got these multi-partner projects, some of the sort of opportunities and challenges around getting multiple partners to work together. So on this project, we had, on Lost Origin, which was like a narrower number of partners, we had 6 different partners, plus more than a dozen specialist subcontractors, whether they were set designers, set builders, and they range from literally one-woman bands through to FTSE 20 companies in Sky. And all of those people operate in different ways. They have different approval processes, different values, different ethoses, different ways of working, and making that come together was, from a kind of project leadership perspective, very, very challenging. And when quite often it is a chain where the links are dependent, it can create quite significant challenges. But that said, when it works, it feels magical, because each one of us, as in the organizations, brought something different from the other. There was a reason that we were a team. And so when it worked very well, and it was greater than some of the parts. But when it didn't work, it was bloody painful. The next one is writing a grant application about how you plan to innovate, work in new ways, get out of your comfort zone. There's a lot of fairly, I would say, standard language that goes into quite a lot of grant applications. The reality of then doing it is actually a lot harder. Essentially, we're all working with humans, we're all human, we all have our frailties, and actually comfort zones are called comfort zones for a reason, because they're quite comfortable. And to do something entirely new is really hard a lot of the time and can be quite painful and can make you feel quite vulnerable and quite exposed. And so that was something I think that we all felt at various points of the project as we kind of found our way in this new space, and trying to create a space where you talk about this up front is really, really important. One thing that was never in our project plan was the fact that what we were doing would become illegal. That was quite a big blocker. So we sort of went into a hiatus period for about 6 months, and that was very, very challenging in terms of keeping things going. We'd hired nearly 30 people to work solely on the project, and we had to find a way to keep them employed when literally revenue had dried up everywhere. And that just leads on to cash is king. So we are a small business. This is not something necessarily that Sky or the bigger partners would feel, but these grant-funded projects are amazing. They're an enormous privilege. They have brought our business huge amounts of benefits, but the way that the terms work is that you are paid quarterly in arrears. So quite often you can incur a cost and you get paid back for it 5 months later, which is nothing down to the team at Innovate who we were working on. It's not their call, it's just the way it works. And for a small business, that can be very, very challenging. And I, personally, one of my hopes is that that is looked into in the future, because the creative industries, there's a lot of small businesses out there. It's inherently casualized, and there are some amazing people who could be doing R&D, but they simply cannot afford to live if they're paid 5 months later. And people like the EU with their grants pay a chunk up front and hit it against milestones. Just from a sort of project leadership perspective, resilience was a big, big thing. It was three and a half years of uncertainty, and we went through a number of sort of near project death moments, and that kind of took its toll on the team, to be honest. It was really about getting people on their feet, keeping going, and that was quite a big challenge. And then also, I think when you have this kind of perma crisis of 3 or 4 years of constant change, the thing I think you often should fall back on is like values and what you're trying to do, and sort of sharing accountability versus your contracts and your plans, because basically our contracts and plans became completely useless about 5 times through the project. But it was, so how do you work through that and make stuff happen? And I think just trying to kind of, Dani used her word of holding the nerve, trying to stay true to what you're trying to do and being flexible with each other was a really sort of, I think it was one of the reasons we got through it, and it required huge patience from all of us. And in particular, we had enduring support from Innovate, who could quite easily have pulled the plug, but they stuck with us, and I think they were glad that they did. And interesting, our monitoring officer, you get someone who is there to basically check that you're hitting your milestones, paying your money, spending your money in the right way. He, at the end, had said that of the sort of 100+ projects he'd monitored, he'd never seen one as challenging as this. So it kind of made us feel slightly better. And then the other thing is just do a wash up at the end. My God, we have learned as a company so much from this. We've just completed another big location-based experience, which is a Green Planet AR experience at Regent Street. There is no way we would have been able to deliver the new project in the way without Lost Origin. And the new project was a huge success. It's the highest rating immersive experience that Story Futures have ever experienced, or ever surveyed. And really the learnings that we took from Lost Origin, and we had a specific session that went, what are all the mistakes that we've made on Lost Origin and how do we not make them again on Green Planet? And I think that gave us a lot of really good guidance for the future. How did you define your roles? Because it just sounds like it was very complicated because of all your different disciplines, a different language, etc. And this is kind of like maybe a controversial question, but within that, how did you resolve conflict? It's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, we had roles and responsibility documents. We had lackeys. We had all that sort of theoretical stuff, but didn't always work, to be honest. I mean, it was sort of and so I don't know, Dani, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean. I think one of the things that helped a little bit was that we took different, partly weirdly because of the way the money was structured, we took different kind of leads in different areas. So the Almeida sort of managed anyone who was contributing to anything that was kind of live theatre. So, for example, if there was conflict, or I don't know, if the set designers were having a bit of a problem with something, then they would come to me or the Almeida Theatre producer involved, and we'd discuss it. And then we could bring it to John, or we could have a direct conversation with, say, for example, maybe one of the art leads at Factory42. You know, there were definitely sticking points. So, for example, there might have been a moment where the digital team was saying, we need the set to be a certain way, and then the set designers would be saying to me, the set can't be like that because of this, and there would be a bit of a kind of a sort of a standoff, you know, everybody trying to be reasonable, but just kind of both for their own very good reasons saying it couldn't be changed. We'd then we'd have to kind of go into a creative meeting where we would discuss where the compromises could be made from both sides, and that a lot of that was myself facilitating that, or one of the producers involved in it. I mean, as John said, during the whole kind of COVID period, we were having weekly creative meetings on Zoom, which is not always the best way to work, as you know. But I think trying to be as open as possible in those meetings to resolve conflict, we did learn that we needed to separate out our. We used to have this weekly meeting, which felt like it would get kind of completely eaten up with logistics. And what we realized was we needed to separate that out from a creative meeting so that we made space to kind of go, okay, we're having a creative conversation that isn't going to be impacted by the logistics now. And we're just going to talk about what we are trying to achieve in this moment. And therefore, what is the thing that can give and what's the thing that actually has to stay? So, yeah, I mean, it's not an easy answer really, because it wasn't always easy.
Yeah, I would just add that there were just simply because she's not here, but she deserves enormous credit. There was the executive producer of the project, Michelle Furlicht, she is a goddess of this stuff, right? And she has such a complex. I mean, the project would not have delivered without her. And she did a lot of the kind of peacekeeping and sort of shuttle diplomacy and those sorts of things. I mean, you know, the reality is actually. There wasn't huge amount of conflict that couldn't be resolved through sort of small meetings. It was fine, but you know, there were, just as Dani said, you know, there were just very different ways, different process, right? In theatre, it's not uncommon show in preview period to be rewritten or reworked, whereas in software you need to lock it 7 months before it goes live. So those were sort of tensions that were worked through, and to be honest, we didn't solve it. We got close and we kind of found a way through it. But we had on our risk register, one of the big risks was bringing together multiple people from different industries and different ways of working. And it was right to be on the risk register, but I think everybody took a pretty mature, grown-up approach to trying to solve it. And if we were to do it again, I think we'd do some things differently, but we did in the end get to an experience that audiences really loved and was completely different and demonstrated what the future might be like. And that was our brief from Innovate, basically.
Wow. Just finally on that, one of the things that Michelle did, as you say, John, was she was brilliant, and her and I worked very, very close together. She created with me and the writer and the Factory42 team, we all agreed on what we called our experiential principles at the beginning of the process of Lost Origin, and they were really useful. So we were able to kind of all agree on what the principles of, and so for example, one of them was technology will always be in service to storytelling. So, but they were quite sort of specific, and so we were able sometimes, if there was ever a kind of a moment of indecision, to go back to those and go, okay, we're sort of benchmarking this conversation against our experiential principles and seeing if we feel that they fit those or don't.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. It's literally, I could ask you a million more questions, but Anthony, you have your hand up, so don't forget to introduce yourself and, you know, say what you're working on, yeah, go for it.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Lilly. In most of my life, I'm a large-scale theatre producer in the West End. Previously to that, I was a digital media agency head. So have a fairly unusual perspective on the problems you're describing and the opportunities that come from the problems you're describing. So I'm currently working on both a West End transfer of Sometimes Into the Woods, which is coming in from the West End, and an immersive musical coming in from America in the autumn, which hasn't been announced yet, so top secret. And the large-scale Luciano Pavarotti musical, which includes immersive sound and holographics and all sorts of stuff for 2023-24. So that's my world. But in this world, I was the co-author of the clusters bid and was one of the people behind writing the Audience of the Future bid as an HRC council member. I'm interested in what you learned about costs and willingness to pay and those sorts of things from the process, because I came to Lost Origin, thought it was absolutely excellent. I also could see how much it had cost. And in broad terms, what did it teach you, or didn't it teach you, about where you put the emphasis in terms of expenditure in production? And what, if anything, did it teach you about kind of audience willingness to engage with this type of experience? Just as an example, from my perspective, I thoroughly enjoyed wandering around the exhibits, and I think you could have made another entire show just in that room.
I agree.
So you know, where do you put your priorities, and what do you think you learned about your priorities and production expenditure and things from making the show? And congratulations on it.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind. Well, I mean, I'll pass over to John maybe a bit more on budget, but certainly what I think we were really pleased with is that I think the set looked really, really expensive, and although, you know, it was pretty expensive in kind of theatre terms, you know, subsidised theatre is obviously, you get used to doing things on a bit of a shoestring, but in terms of the kind of overall project grant, I think we managed to make an amount of money go very, very far, actually. The team were very resourceful. I think one of the things that was really interesting about working in the warehouse was being able to be so responsive to the space and use so much of the atmosphere of the space, and the designers were very good at kind of doing a lot of sort of thrift buying, as well as kind of very clever on-site building. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Emporium it could have been a show in itself, that was space. And actually that was the room I was talking about earlier in terms of holding my nerve, because, you know, some early audiences said they didn't like how free roaming that room was, but that was what I liked most about it. And actually I could have easily had audiences spend way longer in there, because every time I went in there I saw something new. But yeah, I don't know whether you want to say anything about money, John. It was a tricky process, wasn't it, deciding what went where? And
so yeah, I mean, what I would say is that, Anthony, is that the so it's really important to bear in mind that we were 8 weeks from opening a family dinosaur experience and a family robots experience. And so at that point in your production schedule, a significant chunk of your budget has been spent. And so Lost Origin was a salvage job in many aspects, right? I mean, it was a really good salvage job in the end, but had we started with a blank slate and said, right, what are we going to do in a warehouse in Hoxton? I suspect we'd have done something different, but not necessarily. I mean, some things would have been the same. So it wasn't necessarily, it was basically making things work for the building we could get within the time we had available. You know, we had to have a building because the project had to finish by a certain date due to the government spending cycle. It wasn't around creative or audience. It was just, there were quirks we had to work within. I mean, one of the things that I would say, and it's interesting, as part of the original Audience of the Future bid that I think you guys got really right, was the importance of IP. And, you know, that was, when we were going to work with the Natural History Museum, one of the reasons was because people knew what it was and it had footfall. And Lost Origin was a brilliant sort of creative triumph against the odds, but it was a new brand that had zero marketing budget against it. We had to hustle to get the tickets sold. Whereas we've just completed a project with David Attenborough and the Green Planet, and like our tickets went in like less than a day, right? 14,000 tickets went. We didn't spend a penny on marketing. It was all PR, and we could probably have filled that building at capacity for a year. And it's because basically Green Planet had just gone out on BBC One and everybody loves David Attenborough, right? I mean, and also it was a cool proposition. So I think that IP bit is really, that for us is a really important lesson.
Thanks, that's really interesting. It permitted a mini follow-up, we are talking about the importance of, in future programs, that idea of IP and scale, you know, because it was a pretty good salvage job on a pretty big scale compared to most immersive theatre events. How important is it then, do you think, that, you know, there's a breadth of different kinds of projects in schemes like this, where there's very new, very techy, very kind of emergent, but also you're kind of experimenting at the bigger scale with bigger IPs and bigger partners? Because it's, you know, I don't know what Sky's actual role was, John. I obviously know your background at Sky because we've known each other a long time, but, you know, those kind of partners have a different expectation, don't they? Magic Leap, presumably, to you know, very small, very R&D-ish things.
Yeah. So I mean, so the thing about working with big IPs is they have reputations and brands to protect, and they have risk to manage. And so I believe, and I suspect Dani would concur, that we would not have been able to put Lost Origin on in the Natural History Museum. However, I do believe that the audience would have loved it, and it would have brought a genuinely new audience into the museum, but they just wouldn't have allowed it because of certain, completely, and it's not criticism, it's just because of certain values and approaches they have to how they operate, and those are all good things. They're just different from what we ended up doing. And so I think that trying to sort of find that balance between how can you experiment and take risks, and so much about R&D is basically about failure, isn't it? It's about trying to work stuff through, learning through mistakes. And so it's getting that sort of tension right. And actually on the Green Planet project, you know, one of our concerns was, like, you know, when you can't do a half-assed David Attenborough project, it's just not allowed, right? I mean, you have to do something that is fully baked. And so that was quite a challenge, to make sure that you could protect his reputation and the reputation of the BBC, but still push the boundaries. And fortunately, we got there. But I think there is that tension between the kind of the guarantees and the strengths of having an IP versus the risks that IP has from innovating, and therefore the constraints it puts on you as a creative and R&D team. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting, John. Thank you. And Dani, and thanks for the great questions, Anthony. So we have 3 minutes left. Alice, I see you have your hand up. What's your question?
Yeah,
and
so
don't forget to introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm Alice. So I'm an intern at Digital Catapult, working in the immersive team and also the AI team. I was wondering what happens when there is like a big conflict with partners. Like, what do you do? Is there a process? And did you have any big problems where people couldn't deliver? And yeah, how did you get over that?
So within our agreements, so basically when you pull together a partnership like this, it's down to your partners to pull together what your agreements are. I mean, Innovate needs to know there's an agreement and has sight of it, but it's pretty standard to have a conflict resolution policy basically within it, which basically shows how, if there is a, you know, for example, had we all had and we didn't have this, but had we all had a terrible row over something that we just couldn't resolve, there's an established process that goes sort of through various points of escalation and ultimately ends in an independent expert arbitrating over the final result if you really get to that point. And so that is one of the ways. But I would also sort of say that, you know, particularly if you're a very smaller company, size often matters, right? Because ultimately it's the scale and the leverage of the larger organizations that often wins the day. That's what I would probably say.
Okay, thank you.
So it's 10:59. Can I just ask one very quick question, John and Dani? Like, so because Anthony, you brought it up and I was kind of curious. And so what was the exact role of Sky?
Yeah, so Sky's role changed as well through the project, but basically, so Sky was, so at the start of the project, so they provided some really incredibly valuable match funding. They also provided a part-time executive producer, a man called Neil Graham, who's actually now moved to Warner's to do virtual production, a really good guy on immersive. But what they were going to do was, when it was in the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum, they were going to help with the marketing, so driving an audience and also engaging with their customer base to bring people who don't necessarily go to those museums. So it was about audience development, but also they wanted to understand new forms of storytelling so they could understand how they might be disrupted in the future, but also what the opportunities might be. So that was the intention, although obviously it sort of changed a bit, but throughout they were great in terms of holding their nerve and remaining really supportive.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I could really ask you so many more questions, especially about, you know, how you started this partnership and everything, but maybe that's for next time. Because as you said, you can talk about this forever because there's so many valuable lessons in there.
Yeah, and so one thing I'd just love to just add at the end, which is this thing of just going back to risk. We were very lucky that we had the support of people like Matt Sanson, who's on the call, and Andrew Chitty, because they kept on pushing us to innovate and take risks. And quite often big brands would not have done that. And that was their purpose. And so, and also, you know, it would have been easy a number of times because it was blooming complex to keep this thing going. They could have easily just drawn a line under it and moved on, but they didn't. And they had to sort of really work their own internal approvals to ensure that this crazy thing that nobody really knew where it was going to land, if it was going to land, because the world was going mad, and nobody was actually allowed to gather. So anyway, it was just really good that we had this, you know, very committed but also sort of independent funder that was also prepared to hold its nerve.